Welcome to Fairfax County Public Library. We are delighted to have you join us as we host Great Decisions. Great Decisions is America's largest discussion program on world affairs. The program meets to discuss the most critical global issues facing America today. Our topic this month is Persian Gulf security, and our guest speaker is Dr. Dania Thafer. Back as our moderator is retired Foreign Service Officer Mike Carpenter. I don't think any of your 9 overseas postings took you to the Middle East. For our purposes today, were you able to locate the Persian Gulf on the map?
Well, not exactly, Adrian, but I'm pretty sure it's east of Suez, and I think that's close enough for government work, don't you? But I'm certain that our guest speaker today can precisely pinpoint it and explain all things Persian Gulf. And once we've viewed the video. Roll it, Adrian.
Oh, wait, just a few notes about this afternoon's program. Your audio feeds will be muted during the program video. Once the program is over, our moderator, Mike, will introduce our invited guest speaker, Dr. Thafer, and we will begin our discussion. We look forward to a lively exchange of views. Are there any questions? If not, I'll begin the program video.
For American policymakers, the significance of the Persian Gulf region has long been an article of faith.
America and the world must defend and preserve the
vital interests that are at stake for America in the Persian Gulf.
Is a fundamental tenet of American foreign policy.
But as oil prices fall and fatigue mounts from 2 decades of war, some experts are reevaluating long-held assumptions about the Middle East. Great Decisions examines the future of American engagement in the Persian Gulf and asks what the new decade will bring to a region on the cusp of change. Persian Gulf security, next on Great Decisions.
Great Decisions is produced by the Foreign Policy Association in association with Thomson Reuters. Funding for Great Decisions is provided by the Herford Foundation, PricewaterhouseCoopers LLP, and the Nelson B. Delavan Foundation.
A new day is dawning in the Persian Gulf. A younger generation of leaders is taking the reins of power.
We've already seen some transitions. In Qatar, for example, the current emir is in his 30s, I think probably borderline 40 now. There are some other parts of the Gulf. Oman, for example, Sultan Qaboos passed away in late 2019. The new Sultan has taken over.
Mohammed bin Salman is a young leader. He just turned 35. He's the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. And Mohammed bin Zayed, the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi. He's also the de facto ruler of the United Arab Emirates. Mohammed bin Zayed has been around for a while.
Mohammed bin Salman and Mohammed bin Zayed are 2 of the most powerful players in the Gulf region. They're relatively young compared to historically what the leaders were.
In recent years, the Persian Gulf monarchies have become more assertive in their foreign policies.
And now we've seen the political ambitions that has caused the UAE to get itself involved in all kinds of wars and military interventions in Syria, to Libya, to Yemen, all of them with disastrous effects.
Mohammed bin Salman also went on military adventures, namely in Yemen. This is definitely a new approach to diplomacy by these 2 countries. More assertive, more militaristic, more bullish, but it doesn't always pay off, and it has come with a great toll for the people on the ground.
They're destroying one of the most important, if you like, regional cooperation bodies, which is the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council. As much as we want to believe them and to believe their visions, the reality on the ground does not support that.
The newfound boldness of the Persian Gulf monarchies comes at a time when successive U.S. presidents have talked about scaling back American military commitments in the region.
Today, I can report that, as promised, the rest of our troops in Iraq will come home by the end of the year. Tens of thousands of them will pack up their gear and board convoys for the journey home.
As a candidate for president, I loudly pledged a new approach. Great nations do not fight endless wars.
It's long past time we end the forever wars, which have cost us untold blood and treasure.
The US has long had a goal of reducing its force presence in the Gulf to a minimum that is compatible with a projection of US interests. But as long as the US continues to see a threat to its own regional interests from Iran and potentially from adversaries like Russia and China, there will be a case for maintaining US basing and a minimal level of US forces in the Gulf.
Now, after decades of protracted engagement, experts and policymakers are wondering whether it is time for the United States to reconsider its role in the Persian Gulf.
Today, the United States spends about 20 times as much money on military programming as we do on all other forms of foreign assistance. That doesn't make sense, and we've got to start thinking about our ability to project influence in the Middle East through something other than a simple military prism.
I think there is a need for a paradigm shift in the way that the United States has been managing its relationship with the region and its involvement in the region. It has to live up to those principles that built the United States the power that it is.
I see Saudi Arabia and Iran as equally responsible for the abyss that the region finds itself in. They have both played a very destructive role over the last 40 years. It is worth taking that into consideration when devising American policy for the region.
I think it's very important to recognize that a military disengagement from the Middle East and an end to our endless wars and our endless military presence in no way, shape, or form signals an end of actual engagement. It is long overdue for the United States to reassess its policy towards the Middle East in general, but the Persian Gulf in particular.
Thanks to the joint efforts of British, American, and Arab workers, many years of unceasing labor have begun to reap a rich reward. Now, as never before, the drive for new oil reserves in the Middle East is of vital importance to the great powers.
In February 1945, Franklin Roosevelt made a detour on his way home from the Yalta Conference. As World War II drew to a close, Roosevelt was already focused on what he believed would be one of the key issues of the post-war era: the U.S. relationship with Saudi Arabia.
The meeting between Roosevelt and Ibn Saud was extremely important because, above all, it was symbolic. Tying the United States to Saudi Arabia, the U.S. became the protector that can actually protect the oil fields.
When you look back at the historical records and the notes taken at the meeting, they, as far as we can tell, spoke about oil very little. And in fact, the U.S. relationship with Saudi Arabia did not become nearly as robust as it is today until the late 1960s, even early 1970s.
In response to U.S. support for Israel in the 1973 Arab-Israeli War, Arab countries instituted an oil embargo, briefly disrupting the free flow of oil from the region.
The 1973 oil crisis changed, I think, the view of the US in terms of the Gulf parties becoming more assertive. People suddenly became aware that the Middle East and the Gulf itself were no longer countries that could be dictated to in terms of what to do.
Failure to end the embargo in a reasonable time would be highly inappropriate and would raise serious questions of confidence in our mind with respect to the Arab nations with whom we have dealt on this issue.
The 1973 oil embargo didn't last for too long, and oil continued to flow albeit in smaller quantities. But it drew attention to the power of Saudi Arabia, that it could actually use oil as a weapon.
Before the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq in 2003, many critics accused the government of waging a war for oil. But the reality of a war for oil, experts say, is considerably more complicated.
In the case of the 2003 Iraq War, we're still scratching our heads trying to figure out what this war was really about. Americans suspected that oil was the motivation, but we actually don't have any evidence of that. So there are definitely limits in the understanding of Americans for why the United States government uses military force to defend oil and when it's likely to do it.
Oil is so essential still, unfortunately, to the international economy, and we are part of that international economy. Even if we don't need that particular oil, it's going to affect other economies and therefore affect our economy.
After a period of high prices, the price of oil has fallen dramatically in recent years.
Oil price is a global phenomenon associated with supply and demand. There's a lot more suppliers on the market, so naturally speaking, the prices will be lower.
On the supply side, you had all of a sudden in mid-2014, U.S. shale oil and gas production, particularly in the Permian Basin in Midland, Texas, skyrocketing. That glut in supply also contributed to a downturn in price.
Although we have growing demand from China and India, we also have more energy efficiency taking hold, particularly in Europe and also in the US. The result has been lower oil prices. The question is whether we return to the past 2 decades period of elevated prices at any point in time, or whether we go back to sort of a pre-2000 range of prices.
Economic planners in the Persian Gulf have long recognized the need to prepare for the day when oil is no longer a valuable commodity. But putting their plans into action has been easier said than done.
We continue our efforts to diversify our income source by enlarging the circle of those investing in our assets.
It's the addiction to oil or hydrocarbons. Simply put, when you're extracting and getting a lot of money in a very simple manner, it's kind of hard to be disciplined.
We are talking about small countries here with small population. For them to be able to diversify, they need to work together. They need to coordinate. They need to integrate their economies. They need to create a much larger market. And as we have been seeing, this is not happening.
There's just been this assumption that the leaders within these countries would take care of their people, and that relationship has manifested as a strong civil service body generating employment across the board, very generous packages. The revenues associated with fossil fuels have been able to power that.
There's quite a lot of disparity between the various Gulf states. The UAE is definitely the standout, let's say, leader in the region. But Saudi Arabia's critical mass, the sheer size of their economy and their population, also gives them a decisive advantage.
Experts acknowledge that a decline in oil revenues will force the Persian Gulf monarchies to reevaluate their spending priorities.
Questions may be raised as to why there's so much money being spent abroad when people within Saudi Arabia are feeling the backlash of increased taxes and fees, of job cuts, of struggling to make ends meet. And so we may well see increased social pressure that could then build into political pressure on Saudi Arabia and on some of the other Gulf states as well.
I think that expat workers are going to be the most affected, and that's because they are considered, to be an elastic, transient labor force. And basically what will happen is you'll see an exodus of expatriates leaving the Gulf states.
As Persian Gulf oil becomes less critical to the global economy, American policymakers will have to grapple with new questions about the motivations behind U.S. policy in the region.
The U.S. has strategic interests in the Gulf. There are a lot of U.S. universities in the Gulf. There are large communities of U.S. citizens working in the private sectors of Gulf economies. Gulf investment is important coming into the US, so it's much more than just a simple, we provide security and you provide oil.
It's not only about the oil, it's the purchasing of defense equipment and weapons are a large part of US Gulf ties. Also, the relationship, the business relations, and there are a lot of benefits to being in the region.
In the aftermath of the Iranian Revolution and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, then President Jimmy Carter made a bold statement of American interests in the Persian Gulf.
President Carter announced in his 1980 State of the Union address that the United States valued the Persian Gulf as a vital national security interest.
An attempt by any outside force to gain control of the Persian Gulf region will be regarded as an assault on the vital interest of the United States of America. And such an assault will be repelled by any means necessary, including military force.
During the 1980s, the U.S. tried to combat Iran by increasing its presence in the Persian Gulf.
Iran and the Ayatollah now threaten stability in the region. So we ended up having a greater commitment to the security of the region with the formation of at first the Rapid Deployment Joint Task Force under the Carter administration, and then under the Reagan administration, the creation of the U.S. Central Command.
Saudi Arabia is still there after 1979, but Iran is gone, and it's replaced by an anti-American, potentially extreme regime. So the United States turns to Iraq, of all people. We armed Saddam Hussein, and the idea was that by arming Saddam, he could at least contain Iran.
In the early morning hours of August 2nd, a powerful Iraqi army invaded its trusting and much weaker neighbor, Kuwait, and moved south to threaten Saudi Arabia.
Following the invasion of Kuwait in 1990, the U.S., now the world's lone superpower, guaranteed the security of its allies in the Persian Gulf.
I became ambassador to Saudi Arabia in 1989. The war began in 1990. General Schwarzkopf had a plan for the deployment of some 220,000 troops. We worked out terms for their stationing in Saudi Arabia by making them part of my embassy. Up to that point, the United States had only a minimal military presence in the Persian Gulf.
The Gulf War was the first real commitment of a large number of troops in the region, and we kept a fairly large presence there, probably in the neighborhood on an average day of 28 to 30,000 U.S. troops.
Today, the U.S. maintains permanent military bases throughout the Persian Gulf region.
The main support base for the continuing U.S. presence in Iraq and Afghanistan is a Guthrie Air Base at Udeid. There are troops in Kuwait as backup. There's a very active naval presence in the United Arab Emirates, and the Fifth Fleet, reestablished after the war, is based in Bahrain. The numbers vary, but I think it's probably about 50,000.
Getting the place where we can stage and have American troops know that they will be safe and secure and able to do the job that they have set out to do and accomplish their mission is a very delicate piece of diplomacy, negotiations, and building strong relationships.
They say more war, we say no war.
Increasingly, observers wonder how much the U.S. military presence in the Persian Gulf region actually helps to keep Americans safe.
There are times that the United States has to use troop presence in order to advance our interests. But what we know in and around the Middle East is that generally U.S. troops are a very bad way to try to solve what are at their foundation political problems.
I do think a U.S. military presence and as one as sizable as necessary is in our interest because of the capability they provide of having assets forwardly deployed to give us a capability that otherwise might have to come over much longer distances.
I've served in 4 combat deployments in this zone over a 20-year period. I cannot stress enough, having combat troops on the ground in the Middle East does not provide stability, and it doesn't give us any strategic capabilities that we don't already have from our overwhelming military capability with global power projection capabilities.
Many experts say that an American military retreat from the Persian Gulf would create an opportunity for other powers to assert their influence in the region.
Many people believe that we opened the door to Russia having a foothold in the Middle East that it hadn't had for many years. We certainly have seen China play in the region as well. That is a growing concern.
If China and Russia want to get involved in the Persian Gulf, have at it, right? That would not necessarily be bad for American interests. The Persian Gulf, as we've noticed, is a place where countries can get into a lot of trouble.
It is true that when the US retreats, it creates a vacuum that others can fill. Now, does that mean that the US needs to have troops everywhere? No, but it can be more involved without signaling that it is not interested.
I don't know that it's the role of the United States to rid the Middle East of Russian influence or rid the Middle East of Chinese influence. We have to understand as a country that the military and our troop presence is not the only way for us to have influence in that region. China has an enormous amount of influence in the Middle East, and they don't have a single troop there.
Recently, Arab monarchies of the Persian Gulf have turned to a partner that would once have been inconceivable: Israel.
In the past few years, we've actually seen a real strategic convergence of interest of the oil-producing Arab states in the Gulf, the U.S. and Israel, about how to deal with Iran, which is really quite striking.
This is not only a peace between leaders, it's a peace between peoples. Israelis, Emiratis, and Bahrainis are already embracing one another.
The UAE and Israel have been working closely together for at least a decade, possibly longer. So the UAE-Israel deal just normalizes, makes more formal, more open, a relationship which has been ongoing for more than 10 years.
These type of alliances come and go. 45 years ago, they were the opposite. The Iranians were actually tactically behind the scenes allied with the Israelis against the Arabs. And if the United States promotes that type of a game, the Middle East will always be unstable.
In the past few years, a growing chorus of activists has called for the U.S. to stop selling weapons to Saudi Arabia, which has deployed American-made arms against civilians in neighboring Yemen.
When I was in Moscow, I met with President Putin and others, and he said to me, look, if you don't want to sell arms to Saudi Arabia, we'd be happy to sell arms to them. So that's a pretty cold-eyed view of dealings in the contemporary age, but it's one reason why a close U.S. relationship with the kingdom remains very important.
I don't think U.S. diplomacy, international relationships should be determined by merchants of death in the United States or anywhere else. The Russians are, of course, opportunists. The Chinese, too, will sell weapons, as will virtually everyone. But I don't think that should drive commitments that could result in the death of Americans.
At a time when the geopolitics of the Persian Gulf are in a state of flux, some pundits hope the U.S. can play a productive diplomatic role in the troubled region.
I think that diplomacy is absolutely critical. It's the world's responsibility to try to bring about peace and security, but the United States has an interest in making sure we're at that table, so whatever resolutions come remain in our national security interest and not just in everybody else's.
Having been involved in several of these mediations, I know that it becomes difficult because you are viewed as an outsider. And in some cases, you may be viewed as more pro one side or the other, even though when we take on a mediation role, we try to stress that in that role, we are not picking favorites, we are not taking positions.
The United States cannot play a useful diplomatic role in the region anymore because we have taken sides. Our only instrument of power is military, and we're not clearly prepared to use it, nor is it pointed in any clear direction.
The United States should actually, in my view, take on a much bigger diplomatic role in the region, but not one in which it has to lead everything, but rather be in support of measures to be able to bring about greater stability.
Despite growing calls to draw down the American military presence, it remains to be seen whether the U.S. will be able to disengage from the region which, for decades, has been central to its foreign policy.
So I think it was a mistake, for example, for the Obama administration to talk about a pivot away from the Middle East toward East Asia. I don't see any reason to think in the foreseeable future, 20 years, let's say, that the Middle East is going to become less important in American calculations.
The great pivot to Asia that President Obama wanted to see unfold during his time in the White House did not quite unfold as planned. The Middle East has a way of constantly dragging America back in.
For decades, the U.S. has been the dominant power in the Persian Gulf. And in that time, the region has undergone a profound transformation. Now, as a new generation begins to make its mark, Americans must think carefully about what role their country should play in the decades to come.
Great Decisions is America's largest discussion program on global affairs. Discussion groups meet online via Zoom and Google Meets, in person at community centers, libraries, places of worship, and homes across the country to discuss global issues with their community. Participants read the 8-topic briefing book, meet to discuss each topic, and complete a ballot which shares their views with Congress. To start or join a discussion group in your community, visit fpa.org or call 1-800-477-5836. Great Decisions is produced by the Foreign Policy Association in association with Thomson Reuters. Funding for Great Decisions is provided by the Herford Foundation, PricewaterhouseCoopers LLP, and the Nelson B. Delavan Foundation.
Hello, everyone. It's my great pleasure as moderator to welcome today's guest speaker, Dr. Dania Thafer, who you will immediately recognize as one of the participants in the video that we have just watched. Dr. Thafer is Executive Director of the Gulf International Forum. Her area of expertise is on Gulf region geopolitics, U.S. Gulf relations, and the political economy of the Gulf Cooperation Council states. She is also professorial, lecturer at the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies at Georgetown University. Previously, she worked at the National Defense University's Near East South Asia Center for Strategic Studies. She has been widely published on matters concerning the Gulf states and has co-authored 2 books on defense and security issues in the Gulf region. She is currently writing a book focused on the effect of state business relations on economic reform in the Gulf Cooperation Council states. Dr. Thafer holds a master's degree in political economy from New York University and a doctorate in political science from American University. Doctor, we're honored indeed that you've accepted our invitation, and we extend to you the very warmest of welcomes. And I now give you the floor for your opening remarks.
Thank you very much for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here to talk to you a little bit about security in the Gulf region. It is quite a big topic, so I'm going to outline some of the major themes that perhaps overlap with the documentary that we just watched. So a crucial dimension of the Gulf security environment is precisely the issue of whether the US is going to maintain a strong strategic presence in the Gulf region. Many of the Gulf cooperation states have lost faith in the US as a security guarantor. And when I talk about the Gulf Cooperation Council states, I'm talking about 6 countries, namely Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, Oman, Bahrain, and the United Arab Emirates, who are located in the Persian Gulf region. And so, and this is actually my area of focus in my research. So the change in the US's strategic calculus has left these actors in the Gulf region to increase their defensive capabilities and attempt to proactively address regional threats through more aggressive strategies while moving towards more regionalized security arrangement. The close proximity between the wave of the popular Arab Spring, if you will, movements and the decreased US engagement led to the demise of long-standing conventional powers in the Middle East. And if you're not familiar with the Arab Spring, it's a big democratic movement that happened in 2010, 2011 across the Middle East, and had a domino effect and led to many leaders and nations falling. And until today, some of these nations are in warfare in the aftermath of that. And so that changed the calculus in the region. And it caused a vacuum in security leadership, and then this new security reality caused division within the region. It's if one follows the Gulf region, they would notice that the GCC states, which I named the 6 ones, have had more heightened geopolitical prominence than they have before, because major countries such as Egypt and Iraq, Iraq was not as a result of the Arab Spring. It was actually the Iraq War that was in the video, but Egypt fell, which generally took a lot of leadership in Middle Eastern affair. And so now the Gulf states are involved in the post-Arab Spring regional conflicts across the Middle East. And often they have ended up on opposing sides of each other within these conflicts. This is notable in Libya, in Syria, to a certain degree, and in Yemen. And within this period, also the GCC as a bloc, these 6 countries, which have generally been, relatively united, led to these events led to a scramble of their individual interests that often superseded a collective security framework. And one collective security framework that the US has been pushing is the Middle East Strategic Alliance, which is supposed to include the 6 GCC nations, Jordan and Egypt. And the US could not actually succeed in this quest. And so, and this was kind of an approach of the US to also outsource some of the security, I guess, roles that it plays. With a new security environment, the small states, which are, the GCC states, aside from Saudi Arabia, are considered relatively small states, for those of you who are not familiar with them. And they have been really keen on utilizing asymmetric powers and the global governance structure to guarantee their security. And while like larger states, which is Saudi Arabia, have been really asserting their dominance, and UAE also to a certain degree. And so these smaller states have scrambled in order to solicit foreign protection on a bilateral basis. For example, Qatar has been balancing against Saudi Arabia and the UAE by leveraging their alliance with Turkey. And this is what I mean when I talk about a more regionalized security arrangement. There has been a movement towards that. Kuwait has done the same to a certain degree. The UAE and Bahrain have normalized relations with Israel. And so divergences about perceived threats and changing regional dynamics has caused a reoccurring dilemma for GCC states between the maintenance of regional security and the preservation of their domestic security interests. Going back to Washington, Biden has actually been actively working in the Persian Gulf region to deal with two important conflicts or issues. One is the question of Iran and re-entering the Iran deal or the JCPOA that Trump withdrew from. And there are ongoing talks about it. Actually, they resumed their, I believe, sixth round of talks, or will be resuming their sixth round of talks right after Thanksgiving, November 29th. And then there's the Yemen war, which culminated with the Houthis taking power and the Saudis viewing that as their security threat. And the Saudis felt that it was necessary to have a campaign against Yemen that was supposed to be 2 weeks long, but has been now 6 years long. And so Biden is trying to resolve that. Those are two interrelated conflicts because it's viewed by many and argued by many that the Houthis are backed by the Iranians. And so they have been kind of negotiating Yemen at the same time while they've been negotiating the Iran deal and all of that. The entering of the Iran deal happened under the Obama administration and is a deal that upset these 6 GCC states because they looked at it as kind of a way to strengthen Iran and weaken their position. And also they view it as a way of weakening U.S. interests in being a security guarantor in the region. So a lot going on, but right now at this point, in light of all these issues, the Gulf states are realizing that the marginal gains of conflict is diminishing, and they have moved towards de-escalation. And the calculus has now changed based on 3 events. The Al-Ula agreement, which is an agreement that happened in Saudi Arabia at the end of last year, basically saying that intra-GCC divisions, so all of this tension between these states, specifically towards Qatar, because Qatar was blockaded, that they would go ahead and end this blockade on Qatar. So they want to take a more united front because the JCPOA could be renegotiated and the US can re-enter it, and President Biden is becoming the president, and he is not as supportive of Saudi Arabia as President Trump was. And so this way, they wanted to have more of a united front to confront issues as the US's role is evolving. And then you can't ignore COVID and its role in all of this de-escalation. It brought economic havoc for the 6 GCC states that are dependent on hydrocarbons for their economic vitality. And as you might know, The oil prices fell at their historic low because there was no demand. People weren't driving their cars, and demand was so low that the prices fell. And so many of these states began to focus inward on domestic and economic issues, and that also incentivized de-escalation because conflict costs, obviously. And now Saudi Arabia and Iran are involved in direct talks in Baghdad to try to de-escalate with each other, which is different than what you saw in the video, because the video, the documentary was taken at a time where tension was very, very high, right before this de-escalatory period. And so reports about the resumption of diplomatic relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia really engender what many view as cautious optimism towards de-escalations in a region that has really been on the brink of war for quite some time. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Doctor, for your introductory remarks. We'll go now to questions and general discussion. And I'll claim the privilege of asking the first question, if I may. I couldn't help but think while reading all of the material for today and viewing the video and also some other ancillary reading that I did, I couldn't help but think of Sherlock Holmes, who, when confronted with massive problems, would always say to Dr. Watson, you know, this is quite a three-pipe problem. And thinking of that and looking at the Gulf region and the Middle East, I think one could smoke themselves into eternity and perhaps not solve all of the issues that confront us there. I was struck in the film, however, about the need to rebalance. Speaker after speaker after speaker mentioned the need to de-escalate or to refine or take a better approach to the region as a whole. And as you're well aware, and you mentioned, if I may, in your introduction, the T word, I will not refer to him by name, but our former president, who has a penchant for hyperbole, to put it politely, said that the US decision to get involved in the Middle East in the first place, quote, was the single biggest mistake in the history of our country, unquote. So we probably have two schools of thought in the US. Why are we involved there at all? Let's get out totally. And yet we have this more balanced perspective presented in the video today by various experts and analysts who have served in the area. And you yourself in the video said that there are a lot of benefits to remaining in the region beyond countering terrorism, beyond protecting the flow of oil, and also making certain that Iran does not end up in possession of a nuclear weapon. Could you outline some of those other benefits which might help Americans recalculate the need to deploy our resources there?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question? Benefits to what exactly?
Well, in your remarks in the video, you said there were a lot of benefits to remaining engaged in the region. And obviously, we're trying to protect oil there, not necessarily for our own interests, but it would seem, based on what we heard in the video, more for the interests of the rest of the world. I think we only take in about 15% of the oil from that region, but and the rest goes elsewhere in the world. That's always been, since the outset of our engagement in the Middle East, a priority dating back, as it mentioned, to the time of FDR. But beyond that, I think Professor Ulrichs in the video also referred to our other investments in the area, investments from the area flowing into the United States, academic interests and so forth that we have in the area. I think these things tend to be more obscured in the context of our constant military engagement. The thing making headlines in the United States are soldiers dying and bombs dropping and so forth and so on. What are the other issues that are going on? What are the other benefits, so to speak, that you mentioned in the video that we really should focus on more and that should have a greater appreciation of?
So when we talk about U.S. interests in the region, it's a function of several issues. Obviously, the first and foremost, the one that is considered to be the classic one is oil, and it's absolutely true that the U.S. Is not as dependent on oil from the Gulf region as it once was. But at the same token, it is also absolutely true that the oil market is highly susceptible to disruptions. Any major global disruption in the oil market affects the price, the global price. So that affects economies. And so, should the U.S., let's say, decide not to be the guarantor there, and let's say a conflict breaks out, right? Because every time the U.S. kind of evolves its role, there's a vacuum there that someone is going to try to fill. When that happens, and there's some sort of conflict that breaks out, oil prices will spike high, and that affects many people and people at the ballot as well. I mean, people are going to vote for the president or whatnot, and they're paying, a big percentage of their income to filling their gas tank. So it's still interrelated. But I think that the U.S. is not as dependent as it once was. And now the other thing that I think is not really talked about often is the issue of climate change and the extraction of resources. When you look at the shale gas extraction here in the U.S., it's very costly to the environment, and it's very costly and expensive to extract it. So we're still not able to extract oil to a degree that is affordable, like in the Gulf region. And secondly, in these discussions about oil and energy and gas, in light of the recent UN conference about climate change, the Gulf states are considered one of the most climate-friendly places for extracting oil. And that's obviously something that is probably in consideration. Other hard security issues are the importance of securing the Strait of Hormuz and Bab el-Mandeb, and commodities go through these waterways, not just oil and whatnot. And then the other thing is, as the Gulf states have increased in their influence regionally and been involved in all kinds of affairs across the Middle East, they also have invested heavily in Western capitals. And so from a political economy perspective, they have a lot of economic weight. And you even can see this play out in Washington within all the think tanks, but it also plays out in Wall Street. And so they have a lot of leverage. If you saw, President Trump was very, very interested in the Gulf states, and he's a businessman. And so it's true, their business activities have also increased their leverage and their interest and their interdependencies with Western nations. And I think that also goes into the calculus here in Washington. And another thing is, with regards to the US's presence in the Middle East, the Gulf region is kind of the linchpin of that presence. And there's a strong basing architecture that, we have invested in heavily, the Gulf states have invested heavily, and also the Gulf states shares a lot of the costs of the US military being there. And so I think there's some benefits there for continued presence. Now, there's a division about the presence of the US in the Gulf region. And this can be, as probably many of you are aware, the US is very divided these days in the left and the right. And I think that the left and the right are also very divided on the US's role in the Gulf region. The left wants the US to re-enter the JCPOA more broadly, the US to withdraw from the region. I think the right doesn't see the JCPOA in U.S. interest and sees Iran as like the arch enemy. And so, and although there's an agreement that the U.S. should certainly not get involved in forever wars, I think it's mistaken to conflate forever wars with like stopping to being involved in forever wars and withdrawing from the Middle East. So there's different. It's not all the same. There's withdrawing of forces. Yes, that's the most extreme. There's retrenchment. There's decreased number of personnel there. There's maybe evolved way of engaging with the nations. And I think what we're witnessing here is not really retrenchment from the U.S. It's just a change in its reaction to conflict in the region. The U.S. has shown more restraint, yet I think those basing infrastructures really haven't changed in the region.
Thank you. Adrian, do we have any questioners waiting in queue?
The first one is, in the wake of President Trump's withdrawal from the Iran Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, President Biden is caught between a commitment not to let Iran acquire a nuclear weapon and the reality that Iran is already a nuclear threshold state. Iran seems in no hurry to return the deal. Feeling threatened, Israel might move unilaterally with force. Do you have any prescription for resolving this dilemma?
Sorry, I didn't get the question.
Oh, sorry. Maybe I spoke too fast. In the wake of President Trump's withdrawal from the Iran Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, President Biden is caught between a commitment not to let Iran acquire a nuclear weapon and the reality that Iran is already a nuclear threshold state. Iran seems in no hurry to return to the deal. Feeling threatened, Israel might move unilaterally with force. Do you have any prescription for resolving this dilemma?
Well, I wish I had the prescription for resolving this dilemma. I think we have some of the smartest minds worldwide trying to resolve it. The Europeans have been at it. I think, Israel has said several times that it's going to attack Iran and whatnot, and hasn't really. So I'm not sure, how Israel would respond. But what I am sure of is that there's an increased cooperation between Israel and some of the 6 GCC states that I talked about. They've normalized relations with Bahrain, and this is a response in anticipation to the JCPOA. UAE has normalized relations. I say Saudi Arabia is in a difficult situation. I think it probably would have liked to, but it really cannot with some of its social obligations. So, and all of that is a response to that. I think that these states are not seeing the U.S. as a dependable guarantor, and if you would have told anyone 10 years from today that the UAE or Bahrain or Saudi Arabia would consider normalizing relations with Israel, everyone would be like, oh, please, but now the calculus has changed. Their security is really important. So I think they're trying to deter Iran, but I don't think anybody wants to have a war with Iran at this point.
Okay, thank
Any other
you.
questions out there?
Yes, there is. Can you explain, this is from Bill, can you explain what the Gulf countries themselves are doing to protect their interests in the Gulf region? How long do you feel the US and other Western countries need to protect the area?
Well, That's a good question. I do think that, just like the British, they were there for a very long time, but there was a point where they withdrew. I mean, I think the US is also going to get to that point. I don't foresee it anytime soon, in the medium term. But I mean, there have been ongoing discussions about that. I think that there's going to be more of a readjusted role as we're witnessing now. And the U.S. is also keenly interested in dealing with other issues globally in the Indo-Pacific and with China. And so it is in fact true that the Middle East is not the key focus for the U.S. At this time. And the Gulf states have been also in this time diversifying their alliances. And not only, I have spoken about in region alliances for Turkey with Israel, but beyond that, they have been diversifying their relationships with China, Europe, Russia. But I think the big question mark is who can really be an alternative kind of security guarantor to the U.S. That's still questionable. And I think actors in the region are still trying to think about how to respond to this issue.
If I may, I noted in the video, the one professor from Dartmouth University, I believe, who commented upon this and the prospect of Russia or China becoming more deeply involved. Her phrase, perhaps somewhat glibly put, was "have at it." If they want to take a crack at getting involved to provide security or whatever in the Middle East, let them have a go at it. Do you think that's too a little bit too glib on her part? Would you have reservations and concerns about that?
So Russia and China are obviously trying to actively engage in the region. We saw how Russia moved into Syria and has taken on opportunities. And the Chinese, have really this policy of non-interference. And they have a major fear of insecurity in the Gulf region because they are much more dependent on hydrocarbon resources than the US. And if you look historically, the Persian Gulf region has not been peaceful. I mean, there has been the Gulf War, which disrupted Kuwait's oil production, sanctions on Iran, which China still purchases Iranian oil, but still that does affect, I think, that relationship. The Iran-Iraq war, which caused disruptions in two major oil producers. And China has been trying to balance that. So it has tried to have a good relationship with all parties. Its relationship is primarily commercial, and it has a non-interference policy. And I think to have a non-interference policy and be a security guarantor, it would be very hard in the current political context of the region. Russia, of course, is interested in gaining more power, but I don't think that Russia really has the assets and ability to play that role in the Gulf region.
Okay. Adrian, any other questioners?
We've got another question from Bill. He says, you commented on the growing relationships between Gulf states and Israel. Will these moves help or harm the Palestinians' hopes for their own state?
Well, that's a good question. I'm not much of an expert on Israel-Palestine issues, but of course, like everyone else, I'm familiar with the major grievances. The Gulf states like UAE has made the argument that its relations with Israel allow for more leverage to deal with the Palestinian cause and crisis. I think many would disagree with that view. And I think a major part of the leverage that did exist for Israel was, I guess, the Arab unity and the Arab front, generally speaking, against normalizing with Israel. And so I think it's questionable if these movements really advance Palestinian interests. I would say that I think the GCC states, again, as I mentioned in my speech, have really looked at their own threat perceptions and pursued their own interests, and have changed kind of this whole regional outlook for security. They've become more nationalists in their policy, and I think that affects like unity within the GCC or Arab unity on the Israel-Palestine front as well.
Okay, thank you. We have another question. This one is from Timothy Grimes. He says, Dr. Dania, thank you for sharing your time and expertise with us. How is Russia and China perceived by Gulf states versus the US?
Interesting question. I think there's been kind of a more interest with Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and they are the biggest traders with China. And they find China to be a good partner in the sense that, you know, human rights don't really get, there's this non-interference policy, and the Gulf states kind of believe that in this policy as well. Like, they don't want anyone getting involved in their domestic affairs. And China doesn't really address many human rights issues when it does business with other nations or deals with other nations. Whereas in the US, I won't say that our leadership is altruistic, but I mean, they still have to play that song and dance about human rights issues. And so I think the Gulf states in general, especially Saudi and the UAE, feel more comfortable on that front dealing with China. But I think they realize that China, if things were to accelerate in the region, that China would not be much of a helpful player. And so I think they're mixed feelings, but they are, and they have threatened and have mentioned it several times, that they're diversifying their relationships and looking towards China. Now, Russia, I'm not a keen expert on Russia, to be honest. I don't follow Russia that closely. I know more about China than Russia. But what I can say is Russia's role in Syria, and it's perceived to be, I think, closer to the Iranians, are a concern for the GCC states. But I still think that they're still open to the idea of having more diversified strategic relations.
May I ask a question?
Sure.
Okay, Dr. Thafer, thank you very much for coming. And my pardon, I was sitting outside and I lost my internet connection for 10 minutes. So if I'm asking a question you already addressed, you will understand. But it seems to me that the real threat to the stability of the region and to peace in the region comes not from Russia or China or even Iran. It comes from internally within the existing states, their populations. And the fact that you have monarchies that are repressing their populations. What do you think is the chance to have an Arab Spring, a second Arab Spring, that'll sweep through that area and sweep away those monarchies and establish different types of governments?
The issue, I mean, I would agree with you that that, you know, the solution should really lie within the states that are physically in the region. I think the issue is that the GCC states are small states, so they don't have the full capability of defending themselves, and they're disunited about so many issues that it's hard to find unity when it comes to hard security issues. And this actually happened after the Arab Spring. There was a division mainly Saudi Arabia and the UAE saw the Arab Spring and the Muslim Brotherhood specifically to be a threat to their interest, and have kind of decided that secular, more authoritarian regimes are the better option for the region, and have spent an infinite amount of resources and money and influence going into each post-Arab Spring country and trying to influence the results of that. I think the effect of how the Arab people in general and the Arab Spring have lost so much is still, I think, still in the memories, the political memories of these populations, that I don't know if I foresee an Arab Spring anytime soon. Now, will it reoccur? I think the issue is inevitable, right? But when, that's a big question mark.
Okay, we've got one more question. The article notes foreign policy did not play a large role in the 2020 presidential election, and neither candidate articulated a comprehensive strategy for the Middle East. The author attributes this lack of interest to public exhaustion after nearly 20 years of war with 15,000 US dead, many tens of thousands wounded, 30,000 post-service suicides, and 6.4 trillion spent that has led to few lasting benefits for either the US or regional states. With this outcome, why bother to re-stimulate interest in the Middle East?
Well, I think that, so there was a bit of a disagreement about policy. Now, when we talk about the Persian Gulf region and we talk about President Trump versus President Biden, President Trump was very keen on a maximum pressure strategy towards Iran, and was not interested really in ending the Yemen war, and had a very pro-Saudi Arabian stance. I think Biden is very different, although I will say all presidents have, generally had a pro-Saudi Arabian stance, whether they say it explicitly or do not. But they vary a little bit in their policy towards it. They still view Saudi Arabia an important partner in the region. That's what I want to say. In reference to the benefits, I think the benefits of the US and the region is the fact that there was not an actual war between Iran and the Gulf states and Israel, and I think that was the underlying point of the US being there.
In the video, we saw Professor Ulrichsen, and also he was quoted in the article that we read, saying that the concept of security in the region is changing from hard military might to addressing soft issues such as climate change, demographics, food and water security, environmental pollution. How might we, the US, or take it more broadly, the international community, work with regional states to confront these challenges, these soft issues, per Professor Ulrichsen?
Well, I think, climate change is obviously a major issue for the Gulf states. I talked a little bit about oil and climate change and whatnot, but also, the Gulf states are very arid. They have very little water. They use desalination to actually produce water. And with climate change becoming an increasingly important issue, the Gulf states are very concerned and have a really problematic future when you think about it. And interestingly enough, I had a speaker in one of my classes yesterday who really focuses on climate change, and there are concerns in the long term that there might have to be migration out of the region if things continue the way they're going. Food security is a huge issue. And one example of that was when Qatar got blockaded and its only bordering nation was Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia was one of the countries that blockaded Qatar. Qatar had no access to food. Actually, Iran was the one that sent food to Qatar and used it as an opportunity to encroach and have a relationship within the GCC and kind of divide it. And I think the Qataris really remember that, and now they have moved into more food security focused assessments, and have actually brought cows in the country. They actually have like this whole facility that automatically milks cows and have this whole environment for cows to survive there, and have actually worked to grow their own crops and develop their own milk and cheeses and whatnot, which was non-existent. Kuwait is only able to produce 3%, I think last time I read, or 3% of its food domestically. So you think about that, 94 to 97% is dependent on imports. I think that, really talking about the US's role in the region, I think there's more of a strategic role the US can play economically speaking. That would assist also in food security, but also I think when you talk to people in the region, they always picture Americans as like boots on the ground and military equipment and tanks and, Apache helicopters. And the Chinese are always willing to sign a business contract in a business suit. I think that, the US should really consider increasing its commercial ties and weight, and not only in the Gulf, but globally. And that could really assist with food security and so many other important sectors.
We also have a looming demographic issue, certainly in the area, with a rapidly growing and yet a very much younger population that is subject to more and more international social media and other ideas that creep in. And I think that goes back to the gentleman's question 2 questions ago about how do you foresee the long-term stability of the area, given the penchant of the current ruling structure to maintain itself in place through any means possible, taking this sectarian approach. Do you foresee more instability as a younger population becomes more restless and many of these softer issues perhaps aren't sufficiently addressed?
Well, this is really an important looming issue that is, under studied and assessed, in my opinion. The Gulf states have realized that the youth are a category in themselves and their constituencies, and have began to develop various institutions and methods of working with the youth, employing the youth, engaging the youth. Saudi Arabia is a pretty good example of that. Really, Mohammed bin Salman is disliked internationally, for obvious reasons that have been in the headlines. But if you look at his base in Saudi Arabia, he's very much admired by his constituents, who are mainly youth. And he has strategically has implemented so many policies that engage the youth grievances that are not politically motivated. So a lot of social reforms, a lot of entertainment, actively employing women. And so all of these issues have kind of gained his popularity. And really the old guard is the one that has tensions with him within Saudi Arabia. But it's not only Saudi Arabia that has actively moved towards addressing youth grievances. Qatar has, education city and has really been keen on educating and empowering their youth. Kuwait has had a dialogue with the youth in the post-Arab Spring. They have created youth ministries to address the youth issue. The UAE launches a survey for youth across the Middle East and try to pulse what are their issues, what are their concerns, what are their main priorities. But I think the most important issue to address is really integrating the youth in their economic diversification strategies, because studies have been conducted to show that with a large amount of youth unemployment, that's where the instability arises. And I think that is the most important factor that is security related. I'm actually writing a book about youth and elite politics and diversification in the Gulf. And so I'm keenly interested in this topic.
Well, you mentioned economic progress. MBS in Saudi Arabia, of course, has his plan for 2030. But if there are diminishing revenues from oil going forward as the world seeks and hopefully attains alternate energy sources, how might that impact on this? Because many of these states have provided health, education, welfare, and employment benefits largely due to their oil revenues. And if those diminish going forward, doesn't that become more problematic?
Yes. Now, I will say that the importance of oil is diminishing. But I will also say that oil prices are very high right now, even though they were very low last year. And so they're obviously it's the relationship with the oil market and prices is cyclical and related to supply and demand. But I agree with you that its importance is diminishing, but I don't think in the short term. And so what is really important, that's why economic diversification is so important, to be able to develop other industries and areas of focus that can allow them to have other forms of revenues. Many of them have focused on tourism. Saudi Arabia started focused on tourism, but you know that Saudi Arabia has religious tourism that really guarantees income because millions of people go there every year for religious purposes. They've used airlines, they've looked at sports, and all these sort of issues like mega projects. Saudi Arabia has NEOM. Yet I do think that diversification is a major problem for the youth and for the future security of the Gulf states. But I still think that the diversification that has occurred thus far is not enough to sustain them. And the worst part is, when this youth ages, you're going to have a huge dependent elderly population on the next generation that might not even have hydrocarbon resources. So there's going to be a high dependency ratio with very little amount of productivity. Right now is really the opportune moment to take advantage of these youth and create a demographic dividend with their human capital. But I'm afraid that the Gulf states are kind of running late as the time is ticking, and they have not diversified as they should be at this point, in my opinion.
Oh, and speaking of demographic, what are the attempts to control population going forward?
Sorry to interrupt. Warren has been waiting to ask a question. Go ahead, Warren.
Oh, sorry.
Thanks. If one thinks about Iran as being a major disruptor state throughout the region, either directly or through its many proxies throughout the region, how would you characterize Iran's goals in terms of either being geostrategic or theocratic or both?
How would I characterize Iran as geostrategic? Or, sorry, can you repeat that question?
How would you characterize Iran's goals throughout the region?
Well, that's a good question. So I've been around both parties that focus on the Gulf. We have, let's say scholars that are more sympathetic towards Iran would argue that Iran is really on the defense because it's surrounded by the US military presence and all of these Arab states, and it's the last standing Persian Gulf state, right? So I've heard that argument. Now, I've heard the other argument from the GCC states in which they say, well, they feel checkmated by Iran. Like Iran has surrounded them, including in Yemen, in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, and they're just have very ambitious hegemonic goals in the region, and they want to dominate the region. And so I've heard both of these arguments. I think there's truth to both of them. You know, in the post-Arab Spring era, it's very clear that Iran took advantage of these vacuums, and the Gulf states have also tried to take advantage of these vacuums. But I would say that, you know, around 22 Arab states are in the region, and I would say that you know, Iran has been involved in their affairs, and I think that causes an immense amount of tension between the two blocs.
Any other questions waiting in queue, Adrian?
Yes, most of the speakers in today's film indicated a reassessment of our role in the Persian Gulf is long overdue, specifically downsizing our military presence and upsizing our diplomatic profile while being careful not to take sides. Do you agree?
Do I agree with downsizing our military and upgrading our diplomacy?
Yes. Do you agree with downsizing our military presence and upsizing our diplomatic profile while being careful not to take sides?
I think that's a tricky question. Well, definitely diplomacy should really be the most important policy tool used to address all issues, you know, before any sort of military confrontation. Now, ideally, you know, not having a presence in the Middle East would be, you know, theoretically a win-win situation. But in reality, when the US and if the US withdraws from the region, there's going to be a heightened level of conflict between the Gulf states, between Iran, between Israel and Iran and the region. And I'm not sure if it's going to be, you know, a peaceful change for the region. You know, I wish I could say otherwise, but I think looking at what's going on, I do think that, you know, the US strategy should be reevaluated in the region, and more soft power should be applied there. But also the US's presence there right now is the US is not really at war with its presence right now. Like, for example, there's drawdown in Iraq. Afghanistan is completely withdrawn from Afghanistan. So really the US is kind of there as just to kind of maintain its own security interests and not really rock the boat when it comes to all-out conflict. I don't know if anyone really wants the US to withdraw. Like, for example, China doesn't want it because it obviously benefits by receiving its oil imports. I don't think the Europeans want it because they don't want to take any responsibility in the region. So it's a good question. And there's so many gray areas surrounding it, you know. That's the best answer I could give.
Okay, can I ask one more question?
Sure.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Thayer. This may be an unfair question. I'm going to ask you to be a seer and look in the future for 20 or 30 years. And considering the problems of the area, the growing youth population, the repressive governments, the Iranian situation, and possible great power tension, what would you foresee as the best possible outcome for the Gulf states in 20 or 30 years, where they could be? And what would you consider to be the worst possible outcome for the Gulf states? That's purely speculation.
Yes, pure speculation. Well, you know, the best outcome for the Gulf states is that they diversify their economies, their youth contribute to their productivity to build for the next smaller generation upcoming in the region, that there is dialogue with Iran, and that clear leadership develops in the rest of the Middle East, where there are still battles over who's going to take over in these nations. So there needs to be a rise in leadership in the region. Ideally, a situation where aspirations of the general Arab populace is reflected in their governance. I mean, that's obviously the ideal situation there. I think the worst case scenario is, of course, if more conflict builds on this conflict, if these economies are not diversified and you have so many unemployed youth with festering tensions and anger, and in this situation, authoritarianism will definitely increase. Because when the carrots are not out, the sticks come out. If you really study state-society relations, especially in authoritarian regimes, I mean, the worst situation would be if Iran became a nuclear power, and who knows, used it. I wouldn't use it in the Gulf region because that would be counter to its own interests. You'd be surprised about how close, like, the GCC states are to Iran. So the nuclear issue is not a priority for the GCC states. The priority is Iran's ballistic missiles and its regional activities. But I mean, those are the worst case scenarios, because if the GCC states did not have hydrocarbons, I would argue that these states would be in almost a similar situation as Yemen. And so diversification is extremely important for their future security. But I hope that we have the more positive outcome.
Oh, thank you. Okay, another question came in. One of the speakers in the film called for a paradigm shift in America's approach to the Middle East, saying it must live up to the principles that built the US to the power that it is. What are those principles exactly in the eyes of the people of the region, and how should we truly live up to them?
So I know who said that, Dr. Abdullah Babood. I think he's saying that and I don't want to speculate, because obviously I haven't had this conversation with him to be able to speculate on what he's saying. But I think he's saying that the US needs to have more of a human rights focused, like, policy in the region, more of an interest in promoting the will of the people. There has been actually research done about how actually the US has supported a rise in authoritarianism globally. And so that is a concern. And I think that's what he was alluding to, but I am not completely sure.
Picking up on that, Doctor, in the article that we read, it quoted Ambassador William Burns, who is now actually the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, saying that we need a major shift in terms of our engagement in the region, lower transformation expectations. And he specifically said no indulgence of our partners' worst instincts. And President Biden says that the promotion and protection of democracy is one of the key tenets of our foreign policy. Referring to the Professor Babood, how should we go about this in the Middle East? How do we preserve and protect and promote the democracy in that area, and cease indulging the worst instincts of our partners, as Ambassador Burns calls for?
Well, that's a good question. You all are giving me really difficult questions, but
we'll throw you a few softballs by the time this is over, believe me.
Theoretically speaking, of course, human rights should be an underlying focus of US interest. But in reality, what happens is is, I think promoting democracy in the region can be challenging. For example, I wouldn't say that the Iraq War was really in the name of democracy. It was really a horrible strategic decision that was very costly. But there wasn't, after the invasion of Iraq, there is an attempt to have democracy there. And where has that really led the country? And so I think you have to be very careful when you say that you want regime change in these nations, because this can be very concerning, and we've seen it so many times. We see in Libya what's going on there as well. I think though the U.S. can play a role in promoting human rights in within the context of existing regimes and put pressure on them and use their leverage for that. But there are a lot of interests that here domestically in Washington that really challenge that narrative. You have the military-industrial complex, makes a lot of money off of weapons in the region, and that does not really promote human rights unless they put clauses associated with the trade of these weapons. I don't know what to say, honestly, because I have two different hats that I look at, the policy and the reality on the ground, and then, my sense of idealism as what should really happen and promoting democracy. But there were many opportunities for the U.S. to promote more human rights in the region that were lost. In the Arab Spring, for example, there wasn't enough support, I think, for the people's ambitions from the U.S. side. And that was an incredible hit on aspirations of the people and a democratic movement that was actually organically developed there, not one that, other parties are trying to go over there and flip regimes. So I think nurturing the organic movements for democracy should be something considered in the U.S.'s role in the region.
I think that's very well put, Professor. I personally agree with you that we probably could have done. Adrian, let me, if I may, please. I think we probably could have done more during the Arab Spring to support countries in that area. By the same token, can you win other people's revolutions for them? Is that possible? We certainly have found that you can't do it in Iraq and Afghanistan. And, I don't think we have ever absorbed the issue of Vietnam as well as we might have, lingering way back in the 60s and 70s. How do we go about winning other people's revolutions for them? I mean, if it's going to be organic and internalized, don't they have to do it with perhaps some sort of support from us? But democracy is really an aspirational ideal. How do you instill that in another population to really turn what they've been living under into some better form of government?
Well, I think there's a difference between, going and physically getting involved militarily and involved in affairs of a country and being complacent in some of the situations that happen to many of the Arab people. The U.S. really looked the other way. And I think that's the difference. The U.S. did not even use its words of support, which take a heavy weight globally. When the U.S. speaks, people listen. It didn't use any of its other leverage. It's not necessarily a fact that they should be in the hand of any revolution. But I think that the U.S. put its weight in the wrong direction. Even in Syria, the inactivity of the U.S. and the negligence in responding to what happened in Syria. Look at where Syria is today. We have right now, and human security should be really a big portion of security discussions of the region. Right now, there are so many displaced people, more than there ever was in the Middle East, who are refugees and refugee camps all over the place because of the aftermath of what happened. And I think that, we could have done more in that regard than we did.
When you use we, are you referring to the international community or the people in the region themselves, the leadership in the regions
When
themselves?
I say we, I mean the U.S.
The U.S.
The U.S. has a lot of weight in the international community. Of course, the international community did not do their part as well, but I think the U.S. could have done more in that regard.
As well, I think many people lay blame at the door of President Obama that he didn't become more deeply involved. But of course, he was in 2013. I think it was August 2013 that you're referring to in the chemical weapons in Syria. I think he was not overly impressed by our efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan to date, and therefore was hesitant. And obviously, the attempts in 2011 in Libya didn't prove all that beneficial either. So there seems to be and that is naturally culminated in this massive statement of Mr. T about the worst mistake ever, that once we get involved there, it's, we're in forever. And as it said in the film, constantly, repeatedly being sucked back in. So there is that hesitancy. But it's a quandary, and I quite agree with you. It's a difficult one to grapple with. On a personal level, I think we could have done more, and we could have used more moral influence. At least we didn't continue to support Mr. Mubarak in Egypt. But where have we come? Full circle back to where we started. So it is rather frustrating. Adrian, I'm very, very sorry for cutting you off, but what more is there to say from your end?
Oh yeah, no problem. We have a question from Bill. Are the reforms being promoted by MBS having any impact among the people of Saudi Arabia?
Well, yes, it has had an incredible amount of impact, and everyone that I speak to on the ground have praised a lot of his initiatives. Women have more mobility now, and the youth have much more, they would say, more opportunities. For example, the religious police have been pretty much removed from dealing with people in Saudi Arabia. And if you're not familiar with Saudi Arabia, prior, I guess, to this era, the religious police would literally go out and regulate everyone's behavior in the streets, sometimes a little violently. And so that was also a big relief, I think, for the youth. Women are working more than they ever had in Saudi Arabia. So these are all these developments. And I think it's very difficult for people in Western capitals to listen to this because the image that they have about Mohammed bin Salman. But if you look at it objectively and how the people of Saudi Arabia have been complimenting his efforts, it is a fact that the people of Saudi Arabia are happy with many of his reforms. Although he drew one red line that political reforms are completely out of the question. So many of these reforms are social, are related to women, are related to entertainment. Saudi Arabia before didn't have movie theaters, didn't have concerts, and now there's movie theaters and concerts, which is something that I think people here in the US would be like, what? Why is that even a big issue? But you have to imagine for a majority youth not to have any sort of entertainment, to be segregated, to women not being able to drive, and all of these things, women not being able to work. I think these are big changes for the population in Saudi Arabia.
Adrian, any other questions?
Yeah. The article takes a largely benign view of China's role in the Middle East. It wants to do business and not fight wars. It will overlook human rights shortcomings, and it will continue to buy oil until it no longer needs to. Do you agree that China does not pose a threat to Western interests in the region?
Oh, I do think that China poses a threat to Western interests, not only in the region but at a global scale. And I think Biden recognizes that, and that is actually one of his priorities. And there has been tension within the Gulf states about China's role there. One of it is with regards to competition for the 5G telecommunications network between China and the US. There was competition between the two. Another instance was with regards to vaccinations and selling vaccines in the Gulf region. There was some tension in that regard as well. But I think that the tension is much larger than these two issues that I've named. And as each player tries to increase its global influence, the Gulf states are, part and parcel of this, I wouldn't say confrontation, but these major disagreements between these two great powers.
Adrian, any other questions out there?
Yes. Ambassador Martin Indyk penned in a Wall Street Journal article in January 2020 entitled "The Middle East Isn't Worth It Anymore." And analyst Aaron David Michael says it's a turbulent area where more often than not, American ideas go to die. Meanwhile, restrainers, as they're termed, call for continued broad engagement. How would you go about forming a consensual, practical U.S. policy for the Middle East, given our very checkered past there and the current state of our riven politics?
Well, I've heard this term that's been circulated with the generals in the Department of Defense. They call it this buy with and through strategy, for working more with partners and empowering partners in the region to address their security issues and kind of being a supporter of them rather than being the primary actor in these issues. And the US has moved more and more towards that direction. I think, it's a very difficult question to ask. I think the US should really increase its commercial interests within the region and not look at it as from a purely militaristic perspective. I think that, I think other global powers should really have a role beyond just the US being there. And there should be really a serious discussion if they're so interested in securing oil. But more than that, I do really think it's important that regional actors sit down at the table and try to address their major grievances. I've heard so many discussions about how to build confidence between these aggressors in the region. Some of them are like, oh, talk about piracy, talk about climate change. And although I do buy that, I think it's important to build this confidence within these states. I really think that the major security disagreements between these nations need to be addressed with them through dialogue. And, everyone needs to give something at the table when they negotiate. It can't be a zero-sum negotiation. And I think that has been the problem historically, is that everyone is just fully set on having their interests and not willing to give. I know this is a very abstract answer, but you asked a very big question.
You mentioned in your response you think the U.S. should develop better commercial ties or commercial interests, perhaps investments in the Middle East. What form would they take necessarily?
Well, there are so many investment opportunities. There's so many.
I mean, above and beyond oil.
Yes. Well, for example, there are mega projects and ports being developed throughout the Gulf region. And China has invested heavily in these projects, has taken many of the construction contracts. And I think that the US needs to think in terms of these issues more when dealing with the region.
So we need our own Belt and Road Initiative.
Exactly. And you know, Donald Trump, no, President Biden has
Mr. T, please.
has been, yeah, the Belt Road Initiative is kind of a threat to US interests, and China's pursuance of ports and being involved in port politics, which I think the US has kind of neglected and needs to be involved more strategically in these issues.
Mm-hmm. The film today began with the assertion that a new day is dawning in the Persian Gulf, with a new generation of leaders taking power. And it then went on to say that there's a more assertive foreign policy based on military interventions, which to date have largely proven not very successful. It seems, are they trying to replicate what our failed model in that area over the past 20 years? And is this leading, as I think, again, Professor Babu referred to, is this leading to the destruction of the Gulf Cooperation Council? How do you see this? How do you see the GCC really getting back on track to focus on its initial goals?
Can you just clarify your question for me, please?
Is the GCC getting off of track? And is there a breakdown in communication and coordination within the GCC? I think Professor Babu, the professor at the University of Singapore, mentioned that it seems to be losing sight of its original goals for cooperation and development in the Middle East, as opposed to embarking on fruitless military ventures.
Yes, so in reference to the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, it's an institution of 6 states, as I mentioned, that are collaborating together. It was interestingly established right after the Iranian Revolution as a response to the Iranian Revolution, as a united front against Iran. Now, after the Arab Spring, there has, as I mentioned in my talk, has been increased amount of division within the GCC states, and literally almost tore the institution apart. And now, I mentioned also the Al-Irla agreement, in which they ended the blockade on Qatar, but still there are lingering disagreements between these states, because the Al-Irla agreement really did not resolve the core grievances between all of these states. What it did was end the blockade. And at this point, in the backdrop of de-escalation and all what's going on, I think there will be some cooperation between these states, because I think it's now becoming a necessity. The incentive structure right now in the region is more for dialogue and engagement. But underneath all of that, there is still a substantial amount of unresolved issues between these states. And it will be interesting to see how they navigate those issues while they also engage Iran for future dialogue. And it's noteworthy to mention that the balance tipped a little bit when it came to engagement with Iran within the GCC states after the blockade, because as I said, Qatar felt isolated by its counterparts in the GCC and has more outreach with Iran now. So Qatar has good relations with Iran. Oman historically has great relations with Iran, and Kuwait has decent relations with Iran. So that leaves the UAE, Bahrain, and Saudi Arabia. UAE has engaged Iran and is actually has the highest level of trade with Iran within the GCC states. So we have Saudi Arabia and Bahrain really completely confrontational with Iran. And we know that Bahrain generally follows Saudi policy, sometimes Emirati to a certain degree. And so the balance has tipped when it comes to dialogue with Iran, and I think that this kind of forces Saudi to have dialogue and also consider de-escalation with Iran, but still remains how their underlying divisions will reflect in their policy in this new era.
And you have some hope for the resolution of these divisions among the states?
I don't know, should I say cautiously optimistic or cautiously pessimistic, whatever that means.
Might the U.S. play any kind of constructive role in that?
Well, the U.S. Would the U.S. play a constructive role? Well, under President Trump, the U.S. did not play a constructive role. Trump took sides at the very beginning, but I think Biden did not explicitly say it. But when Biden got elected, the GCC states had their El agreement. So I think that they have responded indirectly to a change in administration here, and whoever is the leader here really does affect politics in the region. And I'm not trying to take agency away from regional players, but I mean, it's obvious by the change in behavior when there's a change in president.
Well, good to hear. I see we're drawing down on the 4 o'clock hour, and I think we've lobbed a lot of questions at you today, some of them in great detail, and we really greatly appreciate your answering them with such aplomb and with such thoroughness. Adrian, are there any other questioners waiting in queue, or can we just now take this opportunity to thank the professor for her time with us today?
Oh, well, now's the time for thank yous.
Well, thank you very much, Professor. We're really delighted to have had you here today, and we greatly appreciate you taking this 2-hour time slot to further enlighten us on this very important area of the world. You're going to stimulate a great deal of thinking in our group, and we thank you sincerely. And we thank as well the library for its always supportive contribution to our dialogue.
Well, sure. And thank you also for to Dr. Thafer and also to you, Mike. And before we all wrap up, I'd like to mention that the next meeting will be on Friday, January 21st, 2022 at 2 o'clock. And the details are still being sorted out, but as soon as we do figure out the topic, we'll send out the invitations to everyone.
Well, thank you so much for having me for this thought-provoking discussion. I've been in so many different forums, and you all posed probably more challenging questions than I have with so many other scholars. So thank you for that. I enjoyed the engaging discussion.
Again, thank you very much, Professor. All the best. Bye.